Welcome to Still Unbelievable, a podcast by Reason Press, where we examine religious claims, especially those made by Christians, and we regularly respond to items that are featured on the podcast Unbelievable. We embrace dialogue, but as skeptical former believers, we will also criticise unfounded claims and unsupported beliefs. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable with your regular chaps at the wheel, Andrew and Matthew. Say hello to everybody, Andrew.
Hello everyone.
Excellent. And that is a hello from me, and my big news of the week is, for those of you who are UK bound, is I'm out of furlough the end of today. I'm back at the grindstone doing the stuff that pays my salary from tomorrow morning, which is quite bizarre. It means that the 200 hours I've spent on Assassin's Creed over the last 3 months have not been wasted. So amen to that. Right now, so with that out of the way, our guest today I invited onto the show. We've only literally touched base in the last week because he posted an interesting comment on the Unbelievable Facebook page following a recent episode of Unbelievable about a study that and report that he's been writing on why people leave the Christian faith. And Andrew and I, having a little bit of experience in that matter, thought this is somebody that we should talk to. So welcome on board, Joel. It is a genuine pleasure to have you on, and thank you for being so keen to come and talk to us.
It's a pleasure to be here. I enjoy talking about my research.
And tell us about your research. What prompted you to write this article? And we'll go into some of the details of what you've written.
Well, okay, so I do enjoy talking about my background, so if I can go into that a bit. I find it quite amusing how I got to this point. I'm an artist at heart. I really enjoy being creative. And so as I'm going off to college, this is kind of what I want to do, but my parents wanted me to have a job. So they insisted I go into a field that would get me a career, and they pushed me towards special education for various reasons. So I go into that as my undergrad, and through a series of misadventures, I end up getting a degree in psychology that I didn't want. So after having gotten that degree in psychology, I got the only job I could with an undergrad in psychology, which was working with abused children. And I don't mean to make that humorous. That was a period of my life when I got to see some unpleasant things. But I felt I made a difference. I eventually did get a master's degree in special education, after which I went into a job working with students with severe behavioral problems, and these are teenagers. And then after that, I began to pursue my academic career towards a PhD in behavior analysis, which is where I stand now. So how did I get around to doing the research that I'm currently doing? Well, in about, I want to say 2012, I took up a position as a freelance writer for a online publication called The Examiner, which doesn't exist anymore. So, but their philosophy on doing news was to hire nothing but freelance writers and then give every one of their writers a different beat, if you will. So my beat was in Christianity, specifically Christian apologetics. And so they didn't give me assignments. I had to come up with my own news. And at one point, I decided, why not do a week of biographies on people who were atheists and then converted to Christianity? So I did that, and it was meant to be in a journal pieces. And it turned out to be the most popular thing I'd ever written. And I got quite a bit of response, but one of the responses I got from atheists was, why don't you do a series on Christians that became atheists? Well, the psychologist in me was looking at these biographies as I was doing them and noticing trends and patterns. And so I inadvertently did a case study on what causes an atheist to become a Christian. And it fascinated me. And I was actually interested in finding out what happens when a Christian becomes an atheist. So I began to work on that very recently. About 2 or 3 years ago, I began to collect the biographies for that. And it became much more apparent that the patterns were persistent and predictable in those cases, much more than when atheists became Christians. So I began to make this my life's work, if you will, and I began to pick up the literature and academics, and I've done quite a bit of research at this point, and I consider myself an expert on the topic at this point.
And just for clarification, because I know this is a distinction that gets discussed quite a lot when atheists and Christians meet. When you're saying the word atheist in this context, what specifically do you mean?
Well, of course, that's the question, isn't it? For the purposes of my study, I've been taking the word of the individual who is giving their autobiography or biography. So my question is, how do you go from identifying, taking on the label of Christian, and identifying or taking on the label of atheist? So I let the individual who is giving the testimony define what they mean by atheist. Because if I restricted my research to only people who, professed a particular definition of atheism, I probably wouldn't get any research done at all.
Okay, no, that's a fair comment, and thank you for that answer. Andrew, you had something?
Well, maybe. I wonder if in the answers in the research, so we're going to get much deeper into your research in a minute, and I like the way it's laid out, but you said that there are some predictable patterns, some things that you see that sort of helped you develop a model. Again, we're going to get into that. Helped you develop a model of deconversion, right? And so that's coming up in a couple of minutes as the show progresses. But I wonder if in developing this model, one of the repeating patterns was how the atheists that you came across in writing and whatever sources you used. I wonder if there was a common definition of atheism or some common definitions of atheism among the people that are in the body of your research.
So the definition of atheism that stands most prominently is that which is opposite of Christian. So this is a person who used to be a Christian. They no longer believe in Christianity. They have particular objections to Christianity. And so they adopt the label of atheist as opposed to Christian, as opposed to what they believed prior. So, the way they would define atheism might be the lack of belief, or it might be the belief that there is no God. But what stands out is that they are distinctly against Christianity. So atheism is a reactionary term in this sense.
So I appreciate the qualification. I don't have any pushback there. I am one of those atheists who is not entirely hostile to Christianity, and I'm also one of those weak atheists who would say, I am not saying that there is no God. I am not convinced that any God yet presented to me meets the burden of proof for its own existence. So that's my view on atheism, and it looks like I might be in the minority. So that's interesting.
Well,
it's an interesting place to be.
Clarify something that interests me in my research is that initially the individuals I'm studying, they don't reject the idea of God so much as they reject the church. The thing that drives them out, the thing that really precipitates this change is the church in which they are currently members. And frequently, when they raise objections, they raise objections specific to their particular religious background. So again, I consider it reactionary. They're reacting against something they have objections to, that they no longer believe. And so I doubt that they sat and, thought through the philosophical definitions as they took on that identity. Most likely they were thinking through their particular objections and their experience.
Sure. I completely accept that. I wonder, and this will be a topic for probably a good bit later in the show, but Matthew asked it of me in the run-up. I wonder if in the midst of your research, there is a component of people leaving Christianity because of some harm that they either experienced or perceived that they experienced, and that drove them away, versus something more academic like like not being able to accept the resurrection as a fact or something like that. So I wonder, maybe we can get into that too as the show progresses.
Sure, I can speak to that.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd like to stick on definitions for a minute as well, because there was something else in the introduction in your article where you draw a distinction between two words that me and quite a few other people who are former Christians use interchangeably, and that is deconstruction and deconversion. Can you talk about why you've made some kind of differentiation between those two words and how they're used?
Well, as a researcher, I have to use terms in a technical sense. And so my experience in interacting with the material is that deconstruction is almost used in a pop sense. It's a term that is kind of a popular shorthand for what happened. The thing is that deconversion is the end result of a process versus deconstruction as being the process. So it would be similar to the difference between saying, I calculated a math problem or I solved a math problem. You can certainly calculate a math problem without solving it, but you can't solve it without calculating it.
Okay, I'll get you. And thank you for that. I never thought about those two words in that context, and I think it makes sense with the way you've laid out there. I'm a lazy bugger, so I'll probably continue using them both interchangeably to use exactly the same thing. But no, I think it's good that you've clarified two processes, or rather clarified between a process and a result there, and I think that's actually quite a helpful thing. So certainly for the duration of this recording, I shall try to stick to that. Feel free to correct me if I use one wrong, but I think certainly for the context of your study, I think that's a useful distinction to make.
Well, you can use them however you like, but as a researcher, I have to be very specific about the technical definition of words that I use. So for instance, if I were to say that somebody was very cordial, that doesn't tell me anything about their behaviors. That's just a general, a generalization in which many behaviors could become a category. Does it mean that they hold the door for women when they walk through? Maybe, that would fall under that definition, but cordial is not a technical word, so it doesn't tell me much about the behavior.
Okay, yes, true. And I didn't say this right at the beginning, so I'll throw this in right now. This is more than just an aside. I welcome this kind of study. When Andrew and I were discussing it off air before you came on, there are a couple of points that we made about it that we'd like to see either improved or fleshed out, or bits that were missing. That's not because we disagree with this kind of project. We absolutely want to endorse and support this kind of project, because I think the information that it gives will be useful to everybody, Christians and atheists alike, and I think it will be useful in making better quality conversations across that barrier. So this is more for the benefit of listeners than anybody else. Any kind of critique or criticism that we might give for this is all in the context of down the line, this is going to be a better report for it. And I certainly look forward to talking to you again at some point in the future when this is a full-fledged, more meaty document with more useful information on it, because I think more useful information is great and good for everybody. So with that said, you mentioned later on some models of deconversion. So do you want to set out for our listeners the models of deconversion that you found and what they mean?
Well, the model of deconversion that comes to mind that's not my own would be the Perez-Vallauris model, which essentially states that a person is restricted in some sense to a religious belief, and then they contact secular beliefs. And, the contact between religious belief and secular belief is what causes the deconversion. So, and they lay out the model in more detail than I would be able to do in this conversation. But that's essentially their model, that deconversion is the end result of contact between religious beliefs and secular beliefs.
Sorry, can you just say the name of that model again for me?
It's the Perez-Vallauris model. And I don't have the title of their study directly in front of me, so I could look it up while we're talking.
No, I'm just typing it into the search engine of all knowledge, and just to see if I can find something of it. I found something about it, so I'll try and include a link to that in the show notes. And how did you come across that model as an aside? It was presumably in your searching on the subject.
Well, this model was commended to me by a fellow psychologist who was aware of my research and came across it in the academic databases. So I can't claim the discovery of this one myself.
Okay. Well, so we're about to get into your model, is my sense. And when you were preparing the model that we're about to talk about, did the Perez-Vallauris model figure importantly into the construction of the model of your model that we're talking about today, or is it a reimagining entirely? So, do we need the Perez-Vallauris model going forward to help us understand, or is your model pretty independent and we can talk about it largely without academic knowledge of the Perez-Vallauris model?
Now, I had more or less developed my model when I came across the Perez-Vallauris. So I had to take that information from that study into account and see if it could be incorporated or consistent with my own model. And I think that it can. I feel as if the Perez-Vallauris model contacts something very important in the process. I think it's an oversimplification, but it definitely works in to the model that I have in one of the stages that we'll discuss.
Okay. So maybe we should be done with the appetizer for the listeners. We should just get into the model. I sort of hear the listener feedback right now. Why are you beating around the bush? What are we doing? So tell us about your model in regard to deconversion, because that's what we're here for.
Okay. So I'll lay out the 5 stages of the model without trying to exhaustively cover every stage. We can do that going forward, but the model consists of 5 stages. The first stage is the setting conditions. Now, when I say setting conditions, we're talking about the kinds of things that form the background of a deconvert. When we look at deconverts and we look at their religious backgrounds, are there any patterns or similarities? It turns out there are. And so the job is to categorize what are those similarities. Now, in my field of behaviorism, a setting condition would be something that we would call an establishing operation, meaning that this particular setting, this thing that happened to the person, makes the behavior, the target behavior, in this case, deconversion, more probable. So an establishing operation might be, say, eating a bunch of salt. It would make the behavior of drinking water more probable. So it's basically a thing that establishes the behavior we're looking for, in this case, deconversion. So the setting conditions in this stage deal with the religious backgrounds and the kinds of experiences the person has going forward towards the deconversion. The second stage of the model is stressors. Now, when I say stressors, I mean particular circumstances or things that happen to the person that cause a stress, a buildup, which primes them towards the deconversion event. So to give examples of stressors, one of the most common ones will, of course, be various doubts that come up. They have questions about various things in their religion, perhaps things in the Bible or, the problem of suffering, things like that. Now, in terms of stressors, these aren't the things that, break out and cause them to deconvert. These are just building pressures, things that they try to push to the back of their mind, perhaps, so as to avoid, leaving the fold or the kind of criticisms that might come for entertaining those kinds of doubts. But it could be other things.
Just creates the cognitive dissonance that is sort of the foundation for other events.
Or it primes that. It might not even be creating it. It might be something you push to the back of your mind and forget about, depending on the person or the situation. But yeah, it could start to create the cognitive dissonance as well. And then, there's life circumstances. So for instance, in several of these cases, the person was going through marital problems or even divorce is a stressor. Of course it would be. And problems with the church. We see movement to a different church because of disagreements as a stressor. But probably the most common stressor is the Perez Valoris. It's the coming in contact with ideas that you had never considered before. So say you grew up in a restrictive religious background and then you go to college, and now you're dealing with ideas that you never interacted with before because you were restricted and kind of isolated within that Christian community. Moving to a different location. So moving from the Bible Belt to California, for instance, that culture shock that comes with that would be a stressor. So again, these are all things that kind of prime the deconversion process. The next stage of the model would be the trigger event. Now, the trigger event is that thing which occurs, which starts off the deconstruction process, right? So, we've had a number of high-name Christians who have recently come out and, said they've deconverted. They're no longer believers. And this is something that's been happening pretty frequently nowadays. And so this person will come out and they'll say, this thing happened to me and now I no longer believe. And the thing that happened to them is what I would call the trigger event. So we've got these stressors and they're building up a certain kind of mental pressure in the person. The trigger event would be kind of like the pin that pricks the balloon and allows the release of all that pressure, or it'd be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So basically, it's an event which gives them intellectual permission to start exploring these doubts that they've been kind of accumulating. And so after the trigger event, you have the deconstruction. Now, deconstruction can go in one of three ways. Either the person will try to rescue their Christianity. They don't want to deconvert. They're afraid of the fact that they might no longer believe and what the consequences of that'll be. So in order to rescue their belief, they might engage in, say, apologetics. And this is what I would call content rescue. In order to be a Christian, they have to believe that the earth is 6,000 years old and that the Bible has no contradictions in it and that Jesus rose physically from the grave. And so in order to defend that content, they have to find, arguments that would support those specific beliefs. So that's content rescue. And people like that have generally come from a position where they've said that, their Christianity is a house of cards. You pull away one of those cards, the whole thing collapses. And you'll find that in these stories where, they start to consider that evolution is more probable than creation, and that just the fact that evolution has more probability will cause them to say, well, therefore God doesn't exist, which is a big leap to take. So the other type of rescue would be belief rescue. In belief rescue, they're willing to compromise. It's a lot less difficult. They run into a problem, say creationism and evolution, so they'll just compromise and adopt a form of evolution. They'll run into a problem of, say, information for the resurrection, so they'll go to a position that Jesus resurrected spiritually instead of bodily, or something like that. And this usually results in what I call leftward drift. So it's no secret that, the types of Christians that end up deconverting typically come from what you would consider very conservative or right-wing backgrounds. And when you run into problems like, what I just mentioned, the resurrection, was it bodily or spiritual, it wouldn't be too difficult to take a step to the left theologically and go with a spiritual resurrection and, defeat that problem. But then, of course, social issues are a big trigger event nowadays. So you come to the conclusion that the church is doing something wrong in the exclusion of LGBTQ. And so as a result, you take a step to the left, become affirming, and then it no longer becomes a problem. And so this leftward drift is something that we see in practically every deconversion case I've ever looked at. Now, the question is, are they drifting to the left to save their Christianity, or is it a result of losing their Christianity? And I think it's a self-perpetuating process. You step to the left, you start to become more progressive in your views. You realize more problems with Christianity. You step to the left further and repeat the process until Christianity no longer becomes an option. So that's the deconstruction process. And then, of course, you end up deconverting. And the consequences of deconverting are frequently very unpleasant. You have an identity crisis. Being a Christian was a central part of your identity. And now you have to somehow figure out who you are now that you're no longer a Christian. There's a loss of community. Yeah, you sound like you're willing to jump in here.
Oh, well, I was only in the sense that I was going to loudly agree with the idea that when you lose Christianity, you lose a whole framework under which you operated, well, let me just speak for myself and not for anyone else. I lost an entire framework under which I operated, and one that I didn't have to think about very much, right? Yeah. And so you get it in Sunday school and Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night, and that was one of those every time the door opened kind of things because I was a conservative Christian to come alongside more of the model. And so you do lose this entire ethical system that creates guardrails for you every day, right? You don't have to think about, do you steal from your neighbor? No, you don't. You have a clear command not to, right? You don't cheat on your business deals. Maybe you don't consume alcohol, or maybe you do. I mean, that was sort of up in the air. But there are all these things that you don't do because there's an ethical system that has been handed to you on hold, right? And the deconversion process does mean if ethics are the thing that is important to you as a Christian, it does mean that you have to reconsider your entire ethical framework, and that is a big task. That's a big job, and if you're the kind of person that was thinking about that sort of thing ahead of time, it would be somewhat easy to stay entrenched in Christianity just to not have to do that work, because it is a monumental task. So anyway, just coming alongside what you said, it's a big job.
Yes, it is. And this is what I call a deconversion crisis, and it's worth an entire study itself. In fact, whole books have been written about it, and eventually I'll get around to reading them, because this is a very significant portion of the deconversion process.
There's something I'd like to pick up from what you've just been laying out, Joel, and it's not really the scope of this conversation, but because of what you've just laid out, I feel that we need to address it, even if it's only briefly. And for clarity, here in the UK, where I am, the public face of Christianity is quite different to what we from the UK see coming out over America. And this is the right wing phrase that you uttered. And so can I just be clear on what it is that you're not saying for what you said? Because it's very possible for someone listening to this who have just come out, and the last 2 minutes of conversation of what you've said has led them to think that the only true form of Christianity is the right-wing Christianity. And can I assume that that's not really what you're saying?
No, but that would be part of the setting conditions. There is one. Yeah, I can talk about that later. But yeah, it's a fact that all of the cases that I've studied have come out of a right-wing setting with several categories, which I've outlined in the article I wrote, and we can talk about those if you'd like. But yeah, they come out of, what would commonly be called a fundamentalist church. I like to use the word modal typical, because fundamentalist comes with a lot of baggage that makes it an unhelpful term.
Okay. No, I just wanted to make that point, because it was what I was thinking was, hang on a minute, the only way to stop yourself becoming not a Christian is by being a right-wing Christian. And I really wanted just to get the point out that isn't actually the message that you're giving. You're just laying out what is the most common roads out of Christianity that you have come across. So to rewind to the more pertinent question around the steps that you're talking about, and in the cases that you looked at, is there a typical time frame in which this process happened over, or does it vary greatly?
Well, it's interesting to me because my sense in, interacting with the material, and I followed more deconversions than just the ones that I researched because I listened to a great deal in terms of YouTube and podcasts and so forth, where deconverts give their story. And unfortunately, I didn't take notes on most of those. I wish I had. But, you get the sense that deconverts all come from college or, shortly thereafter. But many of the cases that I reviewed actually deconverted, in their late 30s or 40s, which was a surprise to me because, I assumed that it just happened in college. But yeah, as far as the process, if you talk about from the minute you start experiencing stressors, then that could be years. I mean, that could be, decades. But if you're talking about, from when the trigger event occurs to when you declare yourself an atheist, that's typically a pretty short period of time, probably less than a year in most cases.
As a matter of resource, we have a fellow podcaster that we're friendly with. His name is David. He runs the Graceful Atheist podcast, and his show is entirely about deconversion. Every episode is interviewing someone who was once religious, who is no longer. And so if you're looking for more of that material, The Graceful Atheist is a good podcast. He keeps that going, and he's done a good job with it. And they're all, the timing is all kept under an hour and sometimes much less. So if you want more of those kinds of self-reports, he's a good podcast to follow.
I believe I'd already sent you a link to that podcast. I think that was one of the things I sent to you in our preliminary discussions.
Yeah, you did. And you recommended a couple of good resources, and I appreciate that.
Oh, sorry, I missed it. Apologies.
Dave, just to be clear, I'm a fan of Dave and his podcast, and he's my go-to guy on a lot of these things. So I'll probably best I stop there because this will end up as a gushing fan fest, and we've got a serious topic to discuss here. But sure. Hello, Dave. I'm waving at you now.
So maybe we can go back to the very first step in this model and talk about it in more detail, because I think there's some fascinating. Well, I don't know if anybody else is going to find them interesting. I've got some questions that I've got some questions that I'm fond of, and we'll just see how the listeners feel. So let's go back to step one and walk us through it again one more time, and let's get right into each step.
Okay, so the setting conditions indicate the kind of religious background a person has that ends up being a deconvert. I mean, when I notice that deconverts always tend to come from the same background, this seems significant to me. So I had to make note of the various conditions one sees in the backgrounds of people who eventually deconvert.
So when you did your research on setting conditions and those who deconvert, was this primarily an American study? Because it struck me up front that, and then Matthew brought up, the EU countries and how Europe treats Christianity, and it seems that there are more atheists in Europe. If I remember my Pew Research numbers correctly, there are more atheists in Europe in an environment that is distinctly more liberal than Christianity in the United States.
So the American Atheist recently published a survey that they titled Reality Check. And in the survey, they had polled something over 1,000 atheists within the United States. And what you see in that poll is that the majority of those atheists were deconverts. They were once religious, and then they came out of the religion. So when you're talking about deconversion, you find this idea of somebody who was religious and is now atheist occur in highly religious countries, less than more secular countries. And so I approached the process initially like a journalist, which was a mistake, but the atheists that I found and that I profiled were people who tended to be high profile. And the reason I selected that was because I could multi-source the resources rather than listening to one, 30-minute YouTube video about my deconversion experience. I could reference a person who had interviewed, who had written books, who had, done their own YouTube channel or something like that, so that I can compare the sources and get a more rounded and multi-sourced, idea of their deconversion process. So the people that I chose were big name deconverts. So say Bart Ehrman, for instance, or Richard Price, or the names there. I'm blanking on the current.
No, look, there's plenty. I think Richard Carrier was a former Christian, though I might be wrong about that. I don't know about
he
Sam
was,
Harris,
but unfortunately he didn't talk about it enough for me to find the resources to profile.
Right, sure, and I'm not. I mean, it's not necessary for you to go through every person that you evaluated in order to do research, because I think already just talking about the research in general, it sounds like you did a good job there as a researcher. If people want a marquee of prominent atheists who were former Christians, they can do that Google search on their own. So I still am fascinated by if it is conservative. Let me go further than that. This might not fit into your research, but conservative Christianity isn't always an evil, right? So it is a specific type of very restrictive conservative Christianity that people in the United States seem to be rebelling against, and we can talk more about that. But I'm still fascinated by the idea that people move left, that sort of leftward leaning salvation of Christianity. And so what I would expect to see is that in countries where Christianity is more liberal, I would expect to see a higher population of Christians rather than a lower population of Christians. And the European Union doesn't seem to fit that mold. They have a more liberal Christianity with a higher population of atheists.
So that's interesting because,
by the way, this isn't implicit criticism. I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts.
Can I just jump in here, Andrew? I think the mistake you're making here is you're conflating people who are atheists with people who have deconverted. I think the number you need to be looking at is those who have exited Christianity rather than those who have never bought into Christianity in the first place.
Yeah,
well, I'm not sure. So that's an interesting thought, but I'm not sure there. So in a place where Christianity is more easily tolerated, a Christianity that is less abrasive, Christianity that can be more easily embraced.
Unfortunately, I had to cut out some of Joel's response to Andrew in the following segment. This was because we suffered an irretrievable loss of audio quality, and it really was out of my control, and I had no other option.
This is a more tolerable Christianity, a thing that more people can embrace. They get the benefits of Christianity. So they get a social group, they get a sense of belonging, they get an ethical system, they get all of these things in one package. And so I still think that I'm concerned about why it is there's a region in the world where there's a more acceptable Christianity that has a higher population of atheists, because that is the bit that we're discussing.
Well, I think I can answer that question by going over one of the cases that I profiled. And this would be Ryan Bell, the Year Without God guy. So Ryan Bell came from a Seventh-day Adventist background. And he was raised in sort of that background, and he schooled in that background, and he eventually became a pastor in that background. And so Seventh-day Adventists, for people who don't know, tend to be pretty stringent and restrictive in the types of rules that they hold for their congregation. And so Ryan Bell eventually moved from his first church to pastor a church in Pennsylvania. And he was surprised to discover that the people in that church, the women tend to wear makeup, and people tended to smoke, and they did all of these things that Seventh-day Adventists weren't supposed to do. And so he was faced with the difficult decision of, do I enforce the Seventh-day Adventist rules, or do I become a little more relaxed in my standards, so that these people don't have to, be too, rigid in their behavior. Right. So he decided to relax. Without going into the details, is that he persisted in ministry when the Seventh-day Adventists asked him to stop. He was very socially justice-minded, and he tended to preach more of the sort of love, grace, peace kind of gospel. So this was where he had ended at, and then the Adventists asked him to step down, and, in his mind, he was still a pastor. He was just a pastor without a church. And so he pursued those things which were important to him, which was the social justice type things. And when in doing so, he ended up shoulder to shoulder with humanists. Most of the people he was working with were not Christians. They were people who were concerned about these and just happened not to believe in God. And so somebody asks him, well, what difference does God make? I mean, we are able to persist by the standard. We have good reasons to believe in these standards. And everything we're doing is consistent with what you're doing. What difference does belief in God make? And so this struck him, and then he did his year without God thing, and he came to the conclusion that God isn't really necessary in order to abide by these moral standards and do these important things that I'm doing. And so God just became obsolete and in the type of behaviors he liked to do. And so this might be somewhat what you're seeing in Europe, is that the idea of God has become obsolete because you can persist in these kinds of values and standards under different conditions than religion.
That does bring some light to the question. I think maybe I need to pursue that a little bit on my own. But I do like the answer. I think there's something illuminating there. It is possible that with a more liberal theology, you would expect to see more atheists because, as you said in describing this model earlier, you step left and you step left and you step left. And sooner or later, the Christian project is something you don't need. And so maybe it is natural that a very liberal Christianity goes hand in hand with a higher percentage of atheists. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I certainly identify in my own story. The stepping left is certainly true. And that this is coming from somebody who lives in a country where a huge number of the Christian population of this country is already quite a long way to the left anyway. But yeah, I identify with that stepping left bit. Anyway, Andrew, you were going to say something else?
Oh, no, I was just agreeing. I was just active listening, which is why I should stay on mute more, really. It seems to me that stressors happen all along. And I think we all agreed on that. You can have these stressors very early on, and they continue to build and continue to build and continue to build. Mm-hmm. And so then there's a trigger event. And so my query is about the interface between these stressor events and triggers, okay? Because it almost seems that with enough pressure, almost anything could be the trigger event, right? So maybe it's a divorce, like you mentioned earlier, but it might also be the loss of a job or a problem with a child or the loss of a loved one. It seems to me that a trigger event could be almost anything because really it's just another stressor. And so do you agree with that, or have I misunderstood the interface between stressors and triggers?
Yeah, so stressors have an accumulative effect. And at some point, the culmination of the stressors results in a trigger. Whether or not the trigger is something special, some kind of special stressor, would be difficult for me to say. So it's entirely possible that, it's just another stressor. It's the straw that broke the camel's back.
In your research, this might be hard to pull out of the research because I think probably if I were to report trigger events in my own life, I wouldn't be as clear about the stressors that led up to it. So I'm wondering if in your research, do people report the same kinds of stressors as problems for Christianity as the trigger event? Or are there problems for Christianity, things that they can easily push to the background, and the trigger event is something very different from the stressors that they report?
So that's an interesting question, because as part of the research that I did, I went through and I gathered together all of the objections that I had run into, and then I charted them out in terms of frequency. So I can briefly read down that list of the specific objections that I saw. So would you like to hear that?
Yes.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, that was me agreeing, yes.
Okay. So the list goes: the church's connection with right-wing politics, the racial disparity within the church, creationism, the ineffectiveness of prayer, the concept of inerrancy of Scripture, God's having wrathful or anger towards sin, historical changes in the Christian doctrine. So, for instance, the doctrine has changed through the church fathers and various theologians over the years. Science versus the church. So the idea that, Christianity is out of step with science. Evidence for the resurrection. Bad ethics in the Bible. So these would be things like God commanding genocide, for instance.
Supporting slavery in the Old Testament, all of that kind of thing.
Exactly. Christian hypocrisy. Sexual ethics in the church. Marital problems. And marital problems is a trigger, so I don't know if that would be connected specifically to religion, except for the idea that God didn't stop this problem. The failure of miracles, the concept of hell, the concept of sin. Now, this is one of the bigger. I put it under empiricism, but basically it's this idea that there is no evidence. You look at it, there's no evidence to support it. The historical inaccuracies of Scripture. So this is the inaccuracies of Scripture that relate specifically to history that we know. The concept of suffering and evil. Good people that exist outside of the church. If it's the only way, then, how come we can see people who are exactly as good as I am, if not better, that aren't Christian? Or the problem of other religions. You adopt the religion in the area that you're born, or everybody is convinced of their religion and what makes me the right one, that kind of thing. So on my list, the highest number of errors go to the concept of inerrancy of Scripture.
Interesting. So first, every one of those was at some point a stressor for me. I experienced them all. In fact, my blood pressure is probably 180 right now. I'm stressed just hearing the list. No.
Yeah, I could explain that to you, but go on.
Yes. So, kidding aside, those all seem to me like, under the right circumstances, any one of them could be that final trigger event. Given the right emotional context, the right values in regard to personal relationships, all of that sort of thing, any one of those could be a trigger event. Though I think some are much more likely than others, and that's probably what your research shows too. Is that some of these things are a bigger problem than others. But thank you for reading the list, because that was pretty exhaustive. I think I'll tell you, for your purposes, that one of my problems with Christianity actually is not on that list.
Interesting.
So, or at least I wouldn't have phrased it like any of those. It seems to me that there's a problem with the claims of the Bible not relating. It seems to me that the acts of the Bible, miracles like turning water to wine, or resurrecting someone, or feeding 5,000 or the 4,000, or walking on water, all of those kinds of things. It seems to me that all of those acts don't add up to the central claims that the Bible wants you to believe. And by Bible, obviously the book itself doesn't want you to believe anything. So I'm really talking about its supporters, right? Or a God, if there was one out there. And here are the things that are trying to be claimed on the back of those events, like turning water to wine or walking on the water or resurrection or whatever. That is that there's a God that can live forever, that he that he maintains an eternal torture chamber for those who for those who are condemned. If you think he does, it's possible to be an annihilationist. That this God has the perfect capacity to judge right and wrong, that he cares to judge right and wrong, that he has the ability to speak into people's heads and deliver his message or to prophesy into the future, all those kinds of things. Those are the sorts of central claims that are not actually addressed by things like turning water into wine. And so for me, there was real cognitive dissonance, moments of maybe it wasn't the trigger event, but big stressors, because it's almost the kind of comparison, the sort of mistaken comparison that you hear people make today when they say, well, we can put people on the moon, but we can't cure cancer. And that is, so obviously that's a faulty kind of comparison. The idea that we can put people on the moon has nothing to do with curing cancer. And in like manner, the ability to turn water to wine may say nothing about the capacity to live forever or any of the other central things that you have to believe in order to accept the eternal life story. So anyway, I don't know if you've heard that objection. It is actually a significant objection of mine, and don't know if it fits into your research, but you get it for free whether you wanted it or not. So
yeah, I appreciate that.
So
always about collecting data. So
yeah, well, I'll be interested to see if that turns up in your final product. I suspect not, but
well, if you could sum that up in a sentence or phrase, that would be helpful.
This is Andrew you're talking to.
That was my summation, man. You should hear the full rant. So
I hear you saying the consistency of the nature of God between the acts of God.
Yeah, that is really well done, actually. Yes, that is a great summation, and it may appear that way already in the other things that you listed, but I was sort of listening for it, and I didn't hear it. It didn't ring for me. So anyway, so that gets us through trigger events, and so then we're into deconstruction. Is that right?
Actually, I'd like to ask a question on triggers and stressors. In your research, what is there a variety of relationships between stressors and triggers? I'm imagining that there's probably a bit of a grey area between emerging in from a stressor to a trigger, rather than it being an absolute demarcation. It's probably more of a blurred progression from stressors into triggers. And I can imagine a scenario where people might have multiple triggers and eventually there's one that sets it all off. Does that kind of ring right for you, or are you being much more narrow on your definition of trigger?
Well, I think that there's much to say about the cumulative effect and where you are in your life when the trigger occurs, because I think this may be where the Perez-Valley's models comes in, because when you are in an environment where deconversion becomes a possibility, as opposed to, say, being strictly within the church environment, when you emerge into an environment that would support or make it more comfortable to deconvert, it suddenly becomes a possibility, and it makes it easier to take one of these stressors and take it a little more seriously. Instead of pushing it to the back of your mind, actually entertain it and the various consequences that come with it. And so this is why you see a lot of people doing this in college or in a more secular environment, because they're no longer in a church environment where they're being pressured to, hide these things in the back of their mind or whatnot.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. So one of the more recent deconverts that, of course, featured on the Unbelievable show was the gentleman from Hawk Nelson, whose name is escaping me right now.
John Steingard.
Thank you. Anyway, his stressors involve no longer being attached to a specific church and then touring and going to various churches at various times. And so he's entering this condition wherein he is no longer being supported by a community or an environment. You know, he is more or less on his own at this point. And so it makes it more probable, based on the environment, for him to consider these stressors, to take them a little more seriously because of the environmental situation that he's in. And so this behavior of deconversion becomes more probable based on the environment in which he is currently sitting.
I thought his story was fascinating for exactly that reason, because his self-report is that his stressor was a lack of stressors in essence. So he no longer, in his own writing, he no longer had to believe. So being part of Hawk Nelson, being the front man for the band, there were certain expectations that were placed on him. He's a public figure, and he's expected to conform to whatever broad notion of Christianity was acceptable for him as a public figure and leader of the band. And he, in his deconversion, when he stopped being the front man for the band, that was the thing that allowed him to deconvert. So his stressor was a de-stressor. He no longer had to believe those things, and that's when it, that was the moment where he deconverted, or at least the period in which he deconverted was when he no longer had to believe. He wasn't being forced to carry the load of the band and conform in any particular way. So I thought that was
if you remember how I described the trigger, I said it was that event which gave you intellectual permission to then explore these doubts. And so the fact that he no longer had to assume this role of leadership gave him the intellectual permission to actually consider the doubts that he would not have had before when he was a leader.
I want to pursue that. There's something in there. So the sort of permission to pursue avenues of thought that aren't entirely Christian. So you listed some earlier, things like evolution and its conflict with a young Earth, or you listed several others. I'm sorry, I can't recall them all, but it does seem that one of the problems with Christianity is a failure to embrace openness as a means to develop your own personality. And what that brings to mind for me is identity foreclosure. And I wonder if in your research you have seen a problem with Christianity and identity foreclosure, and how that ultimately figures into people working their way out of identity foreclosure, if you think it is a problem that you've seen in your research.
So this isn't a term that I'm familiar with.
Okay, so there's I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put a pin in this, and I will send you the research on identity foreclosure, and we will ask you back for a discussion on identity foreclosure when your project is finished, and I'll send you the research, and we can talk about it offline, and we'll just leave it as a note for the future.
Okay.
On the subject of John Steingard and the band whose name is Hawk Nelson, that's it. Presumably there's 3 other, or however many it is, band members who have been through the same touring regime that John has gone through, who remain to be Christians. So there's clearly something different that happened to John or something triggered John which didn't trigger them, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Of course, I would have to know a little bit more about their autobiography, which I haven't heard. I've only heard his.
Yeah.
Now, there were two things that stood out as stressors to me. Oh, yeah, okay. So his stressors involved the touring, which we mentioned. And, this is not the first musician that I've seen or that I've profiled for deconversion. And this is sort of a universal thing among Christian uh, musicians that they tour. They don't have a regular church community, and community is one of the driving reinforcers for people who are Christian. This idea that you have a specific community that accepts you and that you're part of, and this is one of the things that makes religion so attractive. So this loss of community that touring musicians go through, and this fact of constantly having to sit in new churches with new approaches and ideas, can cause the technical term for this is tinkering. And tinkering is a term that's used in cognitive psychology, wherein a person encounters a new idea with which they're not familiar, and now they have to adjust their own ideas to incorporate this new idea. So, you could reject it, or you could kind of modify your existing beliefs and ideas to incorporate this new thing that you've run across. And when you're constantly tinkering, when you're going to church after church and seeing new approaches, this itself could be a stressor. So, obviously, again, the other band members went through that. Now, he, in his writings, which I've read some of, he mentioned that there was a big pressure to perform when he was a younger person in a church. And so this is one of the features that I've mapped for a modal typical church, is that there's this performance control. The community controls your performance because each individual within the community holds the standard that the entire community holds for performance. And so each individual reinforces that behavior in each other individual in the community. And when that behavior is not being observed, it's punished through things like shame and guilt.
Okay, from the wider community and the expectations on him, presumably.
Correct. So he said that this was a problem about his church growing up, was that there was this standard that everyone was expected to live by, and that was a difficult thing for him to deal with.
Yeah, interesting you say that. I'm having some memories with you saying that of similar sort of things in my own childhood. You don't know, most of our listeners, I think, are already familiar with some of my backstory. I grew up in a missionary environment in Central Africa. So, yeah, the expectation of how you behave as a child is, that's something that I identify with. So we're now on to the last bit, the deconversion. Do you want to fill us out a little bit on that?
Well, obviously, deconversion is the end result, and the model could stop there and say it's reached its final conclusion. But the deconversion itself has some features which are, of interest. There's a psychologist, H. Gurin, who describes religious conversion, which is another one of my studies, as a conversion career, meaning that conversion doesn't just stop at the point where you declare yourself a Christian. It defines what you do going forward. And so the same might be said to be true of an atheist who is deconverted. The deconversion doesn't stop at the moment they declare themselves an atheist. This process that they began at deconstruction continues thereafter and affects their life going forward. Now, I haven't done the kind of longitudinal studies that I would need to, clearly describe what the deconversion career would look like, but I have, listened to enough and read enough to know that it does affect a person, and typically it affects a person negatively. So, there's this idea. The people who I read deconversion stories of are the people who were most active in their religion. So the idea of becoming irreligious has much bigger consequences for them than it would for a person who, was filling the pew on Sunday and attending Easter service and otherwise, running around doing whatever it is they do with their life, LARPing and playing video games and whatnot. So yeah, the people who are most active are the people who are most likely to deconvert, because this Christianity is a big part of their identity. It's not peripheral. It's not compartmentalized. It's who they are. And now they have to redefine themselves as something else. And how do you do that? That's a big question. More than that, you lose that supportive community, that part which is very important to human beings as a species, that they have a supportive community with whom they can relate, and you lose that. And then possibly worst of all, that community, once they learn that you are no longer one of them, they now have to go through a process of redefining who you are in their mind. So you have the two identity crises. You have your personal identity crisis, and then you have the community identity crisis.
By the way, as an aside, I did catch the reference to LARPing. I don't even know if a lot of our listeners, that's live action role playing, and so I caught it. I think that's great. And do you go to the cons? I just got to know. Look, I mean, look, you spoke it into existence. This is not my fault. This rabbit trail is entirely a result of you mentioning LARPing.
Hang on a minute. Do we need a warning here to our listeners about risk of mental images that are going to scar them for the rest of this episode?
It depends on which cons you go to, really. So, do you LARP? That's cool if you do. I think that's awesome.
I have never myself partaken. I've ridden my geekhood up to the line, but I've never stepped across.
I got you. So look, I'll get rid of the aside. I just thought it was cool, and I wanted you to know I did catch the mention to LARPing, and that's awesome. So Matthew, back to you for a relevant part of the show.
I've still got my mental images of people running around forests in kilts, but yeah.
Oh well, that would be the best possible. So we were on deconversion.
Yes, that's right. We are, and I think this is the point to mention a previous episode that we've done with the fabulous Clint Haycock of the Mindshift cast, and we talked to him, and we had him on talking about what happens to people after they stop going to church. So this is the tail end of the process that you've been describing to us, Joel. And so what Clint was talking to us about was the deconversion and the conclusion and the stages that people go through, which are not too dissimilar to the grief stages in going through that. So what I probably need to do after we've recorded this is compare some of the notes that we've got from this with the notes that we've got from Clint, and see if there's a way that the two stories marry up, and maybe there's a joint conversation we can go to. Oh, I said that on air. Sorry, Clint, I haven't just cornered you, have I? Anyway, maybe we'll have a conversation offline, and we'll see what happens about that.
If I may address that point very briefly.
Yes, go for it.
So one of the things that's interesting in the difference between conversion and deconversion is that deconversion is a very personal process. In conversion, typically you encounter a person that's part of the religion that you eventually convert to, and then you encounter the community, and there's this community aspect to eventually joining that particular religion. Unfortunately, deconversion isn't like that. I've run into possibly one account where the person who deconverted did so under the auspices of a relationship with another atheist. Typically, those relationships are formed during the deconstruction process or after deconversion, as the person becomes uncomfortable with their Christian community and they seek out a community with whom they can be comfortable. But here's the problem with that. The problem is when you walk into a room full of atheists, the reason that you walked into that room is that you are now yourself an atheist. You have nothing in common with this people except for the fact that you don't believe or that you lack belief. And so in order to, sit at a table and strike up a conversation with these people, the only thing you have to talk about that that they're interested in is atheism. And by rote, you also have to talk about religion, because that's kind of where atheism is pointed in some way. And so then to develop these relationships and to develop a community, you have to kind of foster this conversation about religion and the evils thereof. And so there is some unhealthiness to forming an atheist community that only focuses on your problems with religion. And it can result in an unhealthy mindset if it's not advanced beyond that point.
I would completely agree with that. And I consider myself fortunate in that I had already some community that was a community in itself that had no religion as part of it. It was mostly around car clubs. And so I had that as an intermediary fallback. I'm still involved in atheist community, but it's by no means the entirety of my community. And I think there's a good mental health flag to wave there. Is don't build a community on a negative, because there's something that's essentially unhealthy about that. And again, to mention a name that's already been mentioned before, Dave over at the Graceful Atheist, that's one thing that he champions quite enthusiastically is positive community and secular humanism, and how we can be good and better to each other, because that is how you build a community. And Christianity has community nailed. It's got a leg up and a head start over everybody else in terms of how to build a community and an infrastructure of help and assistance and friendship. And those who exit that environment are quite often lost in where they go to for that kind of thing. So I think
I recommend LARPing.
That was so well played. That was really well done.
Kilt's not mandatory.
Something's mandatory. I've seen some of those LARPers, man. You've got to wear something. I don't care what you put on under your kilt, but you've got to put something on. Okay, so I do want to talk about the mental health issues around forming community out of a lack of belief in something. And I'd also like to talk about the potential mental health issues that go along with being in some Christian denominations. So some of the listeners know that I'm a call agent for a nonprofit called Recovering from Religion. And we run the Secular Hotline Project. And the entire Secular Hotline Project is devoted to having people that are willing to just sit and constructively listen and provide feedback and resources for those people who have suffered substantial harm or perceived harm from religion. And so it is the case that atheism can be unhealthy. It's also the case that Christianity can be harmful. And so I want to be a little circumspect about suggesting or even implying that Christianity has a corner market on good mental hygiene, because there are things that are good mental hygiene that don't have to come from Christianity. So we've talked about them. Strong social connections, sense of well-being, sense of belonging, all of that kind of thing. And so I'm just wondering whether your research turned up substantial harm or perceived harm as a reason for leaving Christianity.
So there's two things I'd like to talk about in reference to that. The first is that there is a spectrum between, say, mainline religion and cult that focuses on things like, behavior control, for instance, and your views on certainty. And there's several things that I outlined in the article that kind of play into that. And you tend to see deconversions happening more as you get towards the cult end of the spectrum. And so, I hear when I listen to deconversion profiles, especially shows that are specifically focused on that they don't make much of a distinction between, say, a mainline Christianity and a cult. They'll have people in from both, and they'll just more or less refer to both as Christianity. And I think there ought to be some distinction within the spectrum, because I think at a certain point, something ceases to be Christianity when it focuses around a single spiritual leader and starts bringing in New Age books and decreases the use of a particular scripture or something like that. But, that's a conversation to have elsewhere.
Well, so oh man, we could go a whole nother show on this. I will say that as a hotline agent, what I see, and so this cannot possibly be representative of anything other than my own experience as a hotline agent. There's no systematic research here. It's just whoever happens to call. But we don't only get calls from people in cults. What we generally get is more the call from someone who's been injured by another. And very often that's a Sunday school teacher or somebody highly placed in the church or something like that. Mm-hmm. We get more of those calls than I have taken more of those calls than I have taken calls from people leaving a cult, in the sense that the denomination itself was actually a cult, right? So it isolated its members. It perceived their members are the only ones going to heaven. They have peripheral doctrine that they promoted essential importance. All of those things that we see in religious cults, and they don't have to be Christian, right? This is a sort of cult behavior all over the world, and so none of that is important, except that I was just wondering how much of the personal harm bit you saw in your research. So
don't misunderstand me to say that people only deconvert from cults. What I'm trying to say is that as they approach the side of the spectrum, which, let's say that the end of the spectrum is a dot that represents cults in the most pure form, as they approach that side of the spectrum, they haven't reached it yet, but they're getting close in terms of the features of that particular church. The probability of deconversion increases.
I think that's right. And I would say that would match with what I hear on calls. So the trouble is that there's probably some Venn diagram overlap with these sorts of incredibly conservative tendencies and any sort of enlightenment beyond a person's religious affiliation. And so, I agree that as you move right, we get more callers from, the further right you go, the more instances of callers from that region on the continuum we would get.
So in terms of the abuse by individuals, what you'll find is that in any situation where you set up a position where an individual has the opportunity to have power over another individual, people are attracted to that position that would take advantage of it for personal gain. So, I mentioned that at some point I worked with abused children, and one of the main features of child abuse is grooming. So you take a child and you begin to befriend the child, and you begin to place the child in a position where they're dependent on you and they trust you, and various things like that. And as you approach the point of abuse, you increase that dependency and that trust to a point where the child almost is, open to the abuse that you put upon them. So, whenever there's a power vacuum where people have the one-on-one possibility of abusing, abusers are attracted to that position. Does that indict the system itself? Well, to a degree it might. If the system is creating positions that attract that kind of person, they would necessarily have to reconsider the types of positions and the monitoring that those positions involve. Now, you'll see things like some of the most successful business people also tend to be narcissistic and possibly even psychotic, just because that kind of person is attracted to that position. So, does it indict the system? It really depends on, how the system is laid out and how conscious they are of the types of positions they're creating.
Sure. How much does the system defend past bad acts versus being open to change? I'll just not speak any specific denomination into existence. We'll just
sure.
sort of.
Now, there's another point I'd like to make as well.
Please.
Okay, so when you do a phenomenological study, and the nature of a phenomenological study is you take a testimony and then you try to extract from that testimony the closest to the true nature of what happened as possible. In the case of, I study conversion as well. And what you have in a conversion is the creation of a conversion narrative. So this is where a person looks back over their life and they see the hand of providence and God moving them closer to the point where they, join the church and they're saved and they have this close relationship with God and everything in their life has moved up to that point, and so they create this new narrative looking back upon their life from their new perspective. And the same thing happens in the cases of deconversion. There is a narrative that's formed that more or less rewrites the story of their life up to that point. And there's a question of, the reality of what actually happened versus the way in which they've moved the narrative as a result of the deconversion. So, have you ever seen the movie The Usual Suspects?
Love that movie.
Okay.
It's been a while, but yes.
All right, so there's a point in the entire movie is this guy who's narrating what happened in a particular crime situation. And he tells this whole story to a police officer who's standing there listening to the story. And then he finishes his story and walks off. And the police officer starts considering the story, looking around the room, and realizes that the entire story was a fabrication. And then he starts looking along, and you, the watcher, realize that you were watching a completely different movie than what you thought you were watching.
Yeah.
And the whole thing comes out in this sort of moment of inspiration. It's very well done in the movie. And this is sort of what happens when one converts or deconverts. Suddenly, they look back on their life and it's a completely different story than they thought it was. And so what you have with deconverts is that they tend to look back across their religious life, in media res, if you will. They were having a very spiritual moment. They were having an experience where the Spirit of God is talking to them or something like that. And then they look back upon that moment and they have to reinterpret it through their current mindset. And they realize that they were living a completely different story than what they thought they were living at the time. And suddenly, it's not a story about inspiration or, learning a new tact on life. It's a story about deception. It's a story about, suddenly Christians don't become people who are mistaken. They become liars and deceivers. And, to an extent, this is an exaggeration of what happened based on their current outlook and what's happened to them. So it's difficult as a researcher to extract how much of that reflects exactly what happened and how much of that is a rewriting of the story because of a shift in perspective.
Yeah, that's good. And that leads to one of the points I think that I wanted to respond to, because you were saying it earlier about a lot of or certainly the majority of the stories that you're talking about are people who are at what can best be described at the extreme end or fundamentalist end or literalist end, however you want to describe it, but that far end of Christianity. And as they realized that some of the things that they were holding either were wrong or they didn't work in the society in which they were in, so they stepped away from those, and then they carried on walking, and the next thing they knew, they'd left. And I think I can kind of talk to that kind of experience, because I think those kind of people tend to be more outspoken about their exit from Christianity, because I'm one of them, because they see something that they don't just no longer accept. They actually have left it behind because they think it's wrong. And for me personally, being taught young earth creationism as a child, I absolutely object to that. Not only is it scientifically untenable, I don't think it helps Christianity either. So I'm very much against that kind of thing. I was wronged, and I actually view it that way. I was wronged by having that kind of education as a child. So I speak out partly because I don't want to see that happening to other children. So I kind of get that, and I think that is probably a good explanation as to why you see so many people from that field of Christianity, because the people who have exited that recognize there's something wrong with that and they want to oppose that because they don't want other people to suffer the same way. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
I think the other thing that I want to mention, there were two big things that struck me when reading this. One of them was I didn't see any mention of what is termed religious trauma. Is that a phrase you've come across, and did that feature in any of the stories that you've got, and was there a reason why that specific experience wasn't mentioned?
Well, religious trauma syndrome, as I understand it, is a post-religious system, because obviously up to the point of deconversion, you might gradually be experiencing trauma, which comes to a head at the point you deconvert, and then thereafter is when you would go into counseling and you would, face results of whatever trauma you accrued over that period. My research was more interested in what happens up to the point of deconversion. I was trying to develop a model of the topology of a deconversion. So the trauma that's associated with that is a thing that happens after, or at least comes to light after the deconversion occurs. And so it's something that I've encountered. I've heard it talked about, but I haven't researched it enough to speak to it. I intend to eventually read some of the material and look into it, but it's not something I can speak to based on the research I've done.
Okay, thanks for that answer. And I won't pretend to be anywhere near enough knowledgeable about religious trauma to respond to that specifically. So, dear listeners, if there's a listener who feels that they have the knowledge on religious trauma to respond to that specific point, please send us feedback to the usual email address, reasonpress@gmail.com. And
actually,
we can
there are some things I can say about that. And, because I've heard enough about it it's very interesting to me that in a lot of cases where I hear about this, one of the things they frequently talk about is this idea that, you have to fall back on your belief in God to make any kind of decisions. So there's this idea that you have to pray about decisions that you're making. And it's the kind of this constant cycle of looking to God for strength and wisdom and prayer and so forth. And so, after the deconversion, you have to kind of talk yourself out of all this programming that you've received, and now I don't have to pray, but then again, that is not there to fall back upon. I have to reprogram myself. Another feature which really took me a long time to figure out, because it was unique and it was difficult to comprehend what was going on, was this shift from the certainty that comes from religion to the uncertainty that you have as an irreligious person. So, as a person who doesn't believe in a God and a purpose and what have you, that would be taught by a religious community, you have to be comfortable with saying, I don't know a lot. You have to be able to put things and notions on the back burner for further consideration, or just admit that there are certain things you can't speak to because you just don't know. You don't have enough information. Versus within a religious environment, there is an expectation to be certain. You're certain about the truth of the Bible. You're certain about the veracity of the speaker. You're certain about your salvation. You're certain about this, that, and the other. And uncertainty is looked upon with some kind of suspicion, or, as if it's a lack of faith, right? So, it took me a while to get my head around that, because it's a perspective that I've never had, and I had to really think about it and listen to a lot of the testimonies to get there. But this sudden being cast from a position of complete certainty to a position of complete doubt. The thing that brought this out to me was a study I was reading about fundamentalism and deconversion. And, they had their own definition of fundamentalism. But what was interesting to me was that they put nihilism and fundamentalism on two ends of a spectrum, where in fundamentalism was complete certainty about everything that you believed, and nihilism was complete uncertainty. And the thing is, if a fundamentalist who has this idea of complete certainty takes a step in the direction of nihilism, they almost immediately take a step into nihilism, because they've taken, they are no longer certain. If you're not certain about anything, you're not certain, right? So, they're taking a step in the direction of uncertainty, and they're, at risk of falling into the abyss of nihilism. And, when you come from that perspective, when that is your only perspective, it's difficult to get into a mindset where you're okay with being uncertain. You're okay with saying, I don't know.
And again, that's something that I identify with to a certain extent. And yeah, it can be quite nervy to walk that road, walking away from something which you held with, I wouldn't necessarily say absolute certainty, but certainly a very high degree of certainty.
Confidence.
Confident. That was exactly the word I was about to say. And you're walking away from that, and to a certain extent, you're walking away from it unwillingly. In fact, for me, for a great deal of that walk, it was an unwilling walk, but I had no choice but to make it. And it's a very unsettling experience. And for some people, it lasts quite a long time, and for some people they get through it quite quickly. But the whole process is quite unsettling, and you don't know what to do with it. You don't know who you can trust to talk to about it. You don't know what the consequences are going to be for your social life, and in some cases for your intimate life. And the whole thing comes with a whole host of baggage, which is really difficult to carry. So yeah, it's also, the experience is also different for different people. There's broad strokes which are the same and different people identify with, but each walk is individual. The other thing that jumped out at me, which I wanted to talk about from your report, is the ridiculously high proportion of people who came to faith as young people or children who were brought up in Christianity, or if I dare say the word, indoctrinated into Christianity. There's a very high percentage of that kind of person in those who then go to exit as an adult. And I fit one of your surprise group. I did it in my 30s. No, sorry. Let me just. Yeah. I did it in my late 30s when it happened to me. So I was well out of what would be my college years. But anyway, do you have
it, or when you deconverted?
When I deconverted.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I converted as a child. I was indoctrinated as in the missionary environment, as I mentioned earlier. So, do you have any thoughts on to why there's such a high proportion of people who came into Christianity as a child?
Well, obviously, that's one of the setting conditions. Is one of the most persistent setting conditions. I believe in my studies, the oldest convert I had was about 12 years old, and he immediately started preaching thereafter.
Golly.
So yeah, I mean, this is an interesting feature, and I would say it's probably one of the setting conditions that is predictive of deconversion, is what would essentially be a lack of conversion. Now, one of the things that you find in these studies is when somebody is talking about their deconversion experience, they are very interested in making certain that those who are listening to them are sure that they were a real Christian. Because, of course, when you deconvert, you're familiar with the idea that Christians are going to come along and say, well, you were never a real Christian to begin with. Or, you were never saved and you were just, kind of fell away because you weren't, that kind of thing. And so
happens
when I...
all the time.
Yep. Right. And as a researcher, I can't speak to that. So, I get the question quite often, and I tell them what I just told you. I have no access to that kind of information as a researcher. I can only speak to the behaviors and what is obvious to me. So at any rate, having said that, so when a person tells their deconversion story, frequently they tell the parts of their biography that assure the reader or listener that they were in fact sincere in their Christianity. And so, they'll break it down and say the kinds of things that they believed, the kinds of religious experiences that they had, and the kinds of religious things that they did, like possibly evangelism. They were very successful in bringing people to Christ or whatnot. But then there's this idea that they are all early adopters. They come to Christ. When it comes to conversion and conversion theory, there are two types of conversion that we speak of. One is it's a crisis conversion, and the word crisis in there does not mean that they were having a terrible time suddenly. It just means that it was a sudden conversion. So, they saw the light, so to speak, and, they fell on their knees and they prayed and they became a Christian kind of thing. And then the other type of conversion is a process conversion, which is similar to the model I've been laying out for deconversion. It has a beginning point, a process, and then an end point. Now, the thing that you see with deconverts, at least the ones that I've studied, is that they tend to go through neither of those conversion experiences. They can't go through a process conversion because they're converted practically from the womb. They're part of that community. Conversion, in technical sense, is the movement from one worldview or mindset to another. You convert, right? You move from something to something else. But if you're born into a religion and you're religious by default because you're a child and that's your community, you don't convert from anything else. You don't move from one thing to another. You are the thing. And so the deconversion really is the process of moving from one thing to another. You have a default worldview by virtue of your upbringing, and then you move out of that default worldview. In fact, there is a debate in conversion studies that says that a deconversion is essentially the same thing as a conversion. I'm not in that school, but that's one school of thought. So yeah, that is interesting to me because I mean that would tend to support the notion that the person was never converted to begin with, and that's not a notion that I follow because it seems condescending and it doesn't take into account the person's exit money, if you will. So yeah, I don't propose that people are not Christians that deconvert, but it is very few, if any, that I've looked at have gone through one of the two conversion models.
Thank you for confirming that. It's a source of constant frustration that the most common line that is aimed at me when I say I'm a deconvert is, oh, you were never a true believer in the first place. And I see it constantly, and sometimes I'm okay with it. I can just deal with it. Sometimes it pushes a button and I get quite cross about it, and sometimes I get quite cross about it on behalf of others. Whenever the Unbelievable podcast, for example, features somebody who used to believe on it, I know that as soon as I go on to the comment section under the posting, I'm going to see a large number of comments saying you're clearly never a true believer in the first place. And it's a peeve of mine. It's I don't have many buttons left, but that's one of them, and I suspect I'll never get rid of that button because it's just so pervasive. But to go to the stats about the large number of people who came into Christianity as youngsters and then left as adults, I'm not at all surprised by that statistic. It really isn't a surprise by me at all. I think that's very, very easily explainable and probably should be expected and predicted from the kind of study that you're doing. And the way I explain it is that people who convert as adults are going to do a much more conscientious conversion, and they're going to convert to a Christianity that they're prepared to hold as an adult. And I think the chance of those people then walking away again afterwards, I'm sure some have, but I'm also pretty sure that the chance of those people walking away from Christianity is significantly lower. Those who do it as a child and then faced into it, and it was like it for me, and I suspect it's like it for everybody who went into Christianity as a child, and if not everybody, certainly a very high percentage, is the Christianity that they hold to probably changes slightly as they get older anyway. The Christianity that I held on to as a teenager and as a 20-something wasn't the same Christianity that I held on to as a preteen, and the Christianity I held on to in my 30s wasn't the same kind of Christianity that I held on to in my 20s. So the whole of my Christianity was actually a stepping to the left before I even questioned the Christianity. And then when I questioned it, I finished it off. And I suspect that if I'd been one of those people who'd been brought up in a non-religious household, I may well never have converted to Christianity in the first place if I'd encountered it as an adult. But I obviously can't say that with absolute certainty, but that is my suspicion of myself. So I'm not at all surprised by this stat coming out from the data. I think it should actually be easily predictable. I'm tempted to be very cheeky and say it should be used as evidence that Christian churches should all abolish their Sunday schools and their child groups forthwith to stop people doing this as an adult, but that would just be me using my platform to be cheeky. I don't think it...
well, you're not the only one.
Okay, all right.
It's very common. If I may speak to conversion for just a moment, there are a number of conversion models, but one of the things that is consistent with conversion models is that they begin with a sort of problem in the person's life. It's not unlike the stressors, except the person is having some kind of problem for which they need a solution. And they enter a seeker stage. Eventually the religion is seen as the solution to their problem. And so they go into the next step of the conversion process and eventually end up as a religious person. Now, it's possible in some point that same person could end up moving to a different denomination or converting to a different religion because they see the conversion experience itself as a solution to a problem. This is something they associate with solving problems, and so they continue to convert or be a religious seeker. But frequently, the person just remains in the religion that they converted to because they've seen it as a resolution to whatever problem that they're encountering at that time, versus a deconvert who never entered religion as a solution to a problem. That's just the waters that they've been swimming in their entire life. And then they encounter a problem, and religion is the cause of that problem. And so they move away from religion. The thing about moving to atheism is that atheism qua atheism is not attractive. It's religion that is unattractive. It's what causes them to deconvert, is running away from religion, not running toward something else.
Yep, I hadn't reached that conclusion. But now that you've voiced it, yeah, I'm on board with that as an explanation. I think that works. I was trying to work out how I saw Christianity as a problem. I'm trying to work that out in my head. I certainly saw it as something that was unattractive, so I needed to leave. I think for me it was an evidence-based doubt. I don't know if I would necessarily describe that as a problem. I guess it's a problem in the such that as I could no longer use it to explain what I understood scientifically. But
it might have been the cognitive dissonance that associated with that became uncomfortable remaining in the religion.
Yep, that works. That works.
It seems to me that there are some people that do run to atheism for positive reasons, or at least run to humanism for positive reasons, which often carries with it hand in hand the idea of atheism, and are running away from Christianity simultaneously. And you mentioned one of them in one of the lists earlier, and that is how the church treats LGBTQ community members, and so. If those kinds of social concerns are important to the individual, it's very possible to run away from the church and not just run into, or to be running toward something, right? To be affirming that the church is doing something wrong and not just be running away from it, but to be running toward something that is substantially better in that person's view.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I could see that with humanism because it's a positive mindset. It makes propositions about the nature of morality and humanity and so forth, versus pure atheism, which is just a lack of belief, which isn't even a thing, really.
That's another show.
Well, when I say it isn't
I'm
a
just
thing,
looking at the time clock here and go, let's not go there, please.
No, when I say it isn't a thing, I mean it's not a standard or an objective, or there's no scripture or 10 commandments. There's no law that defines a lack of belief. It's just a state of being.
That's another show.
Fair enough. Maybe I'm mistaken.
Well,
I've never seen atheism as a positive argument for the nature of reality.
Well,
yeah,
that's
but I would say it doesn't do that. No, that's quite right.
But I do think what you do see is positive argument for evidence not equaling the claim. And so in that sense, atheism, when it is being argued for from an empirical perspective, it is a positive claim about the evidence not equaling the claim of Christianity. And so in that sense, I think there's some room for us to have a conversation, at least, because I think at least that's the atheism that I support. And,
okay, so it's an epistemology,
That's right.
At least it's the defense of an epistemology, which is fine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make a positive argument for values or anything like that. It makes an argument for a standard by which we discover those things, which is fine.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Yeah. So it is not.
As compared to humanism, which is a
right.
standard set of values,
Yeah.
which is the
that's
distinction I was making.
No, that's fair. That's fair.
And I was just going to say I endorse that. I'm humanist because I believe in this, that, and the other. I'm atheist because it's a tick box value that has resulted from the rest of my worldview.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right in that if you affirm atheism in either its weak form or its strong form, all of your work to assess values is still ahead of you. So yeah, we're in lockstep there.
That's what I was saying.
Yep, fair enough. So I just wanted to pick a fight at the end for fun.
Bring it.
See, and I promise the listeners that one day we will find a topic that will make you cross enough to raise your voice.
I apologize. I could probably go there.
we will eventually know what it means for someone British to be cross. We will
make a cup of tea in the wrong way. That is how you make a British person cross.
Oh, so Instagram says, man. The whole
or serve beer too cold. That's another one. Anyway, before this sinks into the quagmire of whatever, then so I fear we're losing him already. I think, Joel, there's one question I'd like to ask you, having gone through all of this. What should the caring Christian do in response to somebody who is a friend, a loved one, somebody that they care about, who has gone down this road or has passed the point of no return? What's the best way for the Christian to respond to this, to affirm to the leaver, that they're still a valued human being?
So the problem with a person going from Christian to non-Christian is that the loss of community. And, if the Christian community abandons that person by virtue of them no longer believing the same things that they do, then that's the fault of the Christian community. Now, I've equally heard about people who have deconverted who are no longer comfortable around Christians because of the elephant in the room. And so, it's a problem that goes both ways. But, I would advise a Christian to be respectful, to listen to the person as if they were another adult holding another opinion. It is possible to disagree without being disagreeable, and
Amen.
To remain a friend with that person and supportive of that person, in all ways that don't, directly relate to the disagreement between their ideologies, which is possible to do. So if you are able to remain a friend to this person who is going through a stressful situation and to support them in their view, which is possible, it's possible to disagree and be adults about it, then you have done them a great service, because otherwise they're on their own. They're all alone. And to please do not focus on bringing them back. Let them be who they are. The pressure is placed upon a Christian to reconvert them, and the Christian feels guilty or somehow responsible if they don't. If this person remains an atheist for the rest of their life, the Christian sees it as a failure upon their shoulders. But it isn't. And this person is responsible for their own decisions. You be the friend that you have been to this person. Do not change that relationship because you now disagree about something.
I want to come alongside that because there's a current in the atheist movement to see religion, and specifically Christianity, as a mental illness. And if you collect enough atheists in a room, somebody will say it out loud. And so I want to say to our more strident listeners, if you are that kind of atheist, you haven't done your homework either. Religion doesn't equal mental illness. It only means that the person across from you disagrees with you, potentially about ontology and epistemology, and how you reach those decisions about how you treat people in your life. Those will differ. But the things that you do agree on are probably substantially more important. And the things that you will likely agree on is not harming each other, not cheating each other, not abusing each other, about how to conduct society. So there is ground for substantial agreement. And we can probably lose the tone and rhetoric on both sides and be better off.
Absolutely. Fully agree.
Yeah, and I'll put my hand up. I've been guilty of unhelpful comments towards Christian friends and people who aren't friends, but I've still said unwelcome and unhelpful for things. So yeah, we can all learn in that. And I want to completely endorse the response you gave to that question, Joel. Thank you for that. It was really good to hear it.
I appreciate you saying so.
Matthew, closing?
I have nothing else to ask or say about the study. Do you?
I don't, but Joel, I would like to first ask, maybe not first because we're all the way down to the last, but I would like to give you an opportunity to tell the listeners where they can find you, because that's important. You've said some interesting things. The listeners ought to be able to follow you. And so how do they get in touch?
So I would recommend following the Facebook page that I have for my research, which is titled Switching Sides. And it's titled that because I study both conversion and deconversion. And I post the results of my research on there practically several times a day. And then my Twitter feed is @SidesSwitching, or you can visit my webpage, which is joelfurches.com.
And for the listeners, because some of them are from the South like me and they can't spell, give us the vanity domain again. Spell it for us.
Okay. joelfurches.com is JOEL, and then Furches is spelled F as in Foxtrot, UR, C as in Charlie, HES.
Perfect.
And we'll try to include links to all those in our show notes as well anyway.
Joel, speaking for myself, it's been a pleasure. I really have enjoyed the conversation, the attention to detail in your writing, and I hope that you'll consider coming back on with us when your project is completed. I guess this is going to become a book, right?
Well, one would hope, but I don't have a interested publisher just yet. Honestly, my goal would be to have it published as an academic study. I have done academic things. I've taken sample sizes. I've pulled out trends, and I've done research into, other academic research that's been done in the field. So I would hope to develop it as a paper, but as a popular work would be welcome as well. So yes, I would be happy to come back on and talk about my research. It's constantly going, so I'm learning new things all the time. And now that you've recommended a resource where I can hear new deconversion stories, I can now process those into the research I've already done to get a bigger sample size.
Excellent. Well, I hope that. And actually, sorry to talk over you, Andrew. I've just remembered a question that I think I mentioned or hinted at in email when we're touching base. I think I mentioned something about I'd like to see if there's any predictive qualities on that. Is what you've done mature enough that you'd be able to do a test case predictor on, I was going to say individuals, that's putting too much of a pressure on it, but a certain type of individual, or maybe even an individual that they may deconvert, and then is that in a piece of paper in an envelope somewhere, so you can then pull it out in a few years' time and go, aha?
Well, I mean, in order to predict an individual's deconversion, I would need to know about their background and where they stand currently. I actually have my eye on a friend of mine, or an acquaintance, I suppose, who came out of a restrictive homeschool environment, raised in the church, and then she transitioned into college, and now she's been doing the leftward drift that I've talked about. And I wouldn't be very surprised if she ended up deconverting, in which case, she's a good candidate for deconversion based on my study. But that's the only person I have, and of course, you'd have to grab a person early in the process,
yes,
and
of course,
see the path they're taking in order to do that prediction, which would be difficult to do. You'd have to catch them closer to the end of the process.
Yes, I get that, and I appreciate there's a cheekiness in that question, but it would be if it's all well and good doing a retrospective study, but if you can show it in real time, that adds weight and validity to what you've gone, it enables you to fine tune some processes. So thank you for entertaining the question. It's one of those things. One thing that for the listeners, one thing that Andrew and I like to do to some of our guests is ask them if they have a favorite Bible character, and just tell us who that character is.
Okay, I think it's a hard question to answer, but I think probably it would be Job.
Okay, would you like to expand on that? I'm curious.
Sure. So Job is a first-rate philosopher. And the thing about the book of Job is people read the beginning and read the end, and that's about all they read of the book. There's a significant chunk of material in between the beginning and the end, and there's many interesting features of that material. I think the book of Job probably asks some of the most important questions in the whole of Scripture, and it's widely considered to be possibly the earliest work that was authored within the collection of Scripture in the Bible. And one of the interesting features of Job is, the Middle Eastern religions like Hinduism go back centuries to millennia to possibly some of the oldest religions out there. And Job almost seems like a argument against karma specifically, because the argument that his friends are making in that book is a very karmic argument that bad deeds are punished and good deeds are rewarded. And he's only suffering because he did something bad, which is a very Eastern outlook. And of course, he's making an argument against that it's possible to suffer and also not have done anything bad. And then that raises the question of what about justice? And that's a point that's reviewed extremely in there. So Job is a first-rate philosopher. Even if you don't believe a thing in the Bible, it's a very interesting bit of philosophy to read.
Job is interesting philosophy. I love the book, and it has the coolest description of Leviathan. It's maybe the only description in the Bible.
I was going to say, is there another?
No, I think it is the only one. But dude, it's super cool, right? I think that's chapter 39 or 40, if I remember correctly.
I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, it's all right. Look, Job is an interesting read, and not only do you have that that karmic discussion, but there's the whole question of the interaction of good and evil behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a great book. It is.
Yeah.
So, Matthew, is there anything else? Are we going to invite people to reach out to us at Reason?
You do that. You do that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Still Unbelievable. If you have questions for us, we encourage you to reach out to us at reasonpress@gmail.com, or in the show notes, you can click on the link and leave us a voicemail message. And please do reach out to Joel if you have questions. We're looking forward to having him back on the show in the not distant future. And thank you for listening to this episode of Still Unbelievable. We'll catch you next time.
Cheers. Thanks, Joel.
No problem. Outro music now?
Yeah. That's
You have been listening to a podcast by Reason Press. To get in touch, email reasonpress@gmail.com or see our website, reasonpress.net, where you'll also find our book, Still Unbelievable. We welcome more feedback, and you might even end up on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. You can hear more of her music at soundcloud.com/hollybishop. You can support us by buying some of Holly's music and telling her we sent you.